here on G4G, and we are talking about the end of the April season and the beginning of the new season, which is here in May and is the Guardians of the Galaxy season. And we have a new card, Nebula, that we need to talk about, as it's very interesting. Before we get into how my season wrapped up and what we're going to look at for Nebula, I just wanted to show you this article that I ran into today, literally just minutes before recording this video, and that was a interview with Ben Brody about Agatha Harkness. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this is because that's who was my main deck, or that's who was in my main deck at the end of the animal season, or the April season over here. In this particular Kotaku article, Ben Brody says that Second Dinner was terrified for years of Agatha and how her routine was going to run. He basically says, we wanted to blow their minds and make them think anything can happen. He has legitimately said that Agatha is supposed to be completely random, that she will do dumb things if provided the opportunity, and that is because of her random nature. He brings out the example of Medusa, where Medusa generally wants to play in the middle, so she's boosted, but Agatha will treat the locations and the cards completely random, so she may not always make what the human would consider the best play. And that, of course, is the risk-reward of having Agatha in your deck and having her be completely random. The last deck that I was using was Cerebro 3, so she's not going to show up there. We can find that out more in a moment. But anyway, yeah, so here is where he mentions about Medusa. Agatha plays Medusa all over the place, and Brody was like, don't rely on her at all, but if you do put faith in her, maybe don't pair her up in Medusa. Why have her at all if you're supposed to actually play her? And what's interesting is Brody does not cop to saying, well, the best thing about Agatha is finding ways of using her strength and getting rid of her weakness, which is the fact that the AI is controlling her. He's not mentioning things like Wave or Sif Ghost Rider or anything like that. The only thing he says is, I would rather you don't play her. I'd rather you make the decisions yourself, but we really wanted this unique thing in the game. And he does mention that originally Agatha's abilities were supposed to be with Adam Warlock, but because WandaVision came out, and he doesn't want to spoil anything, but all along he makes a reference to that, that is when things switched to Agatha. Now, Agatha is definitely, you can corral Agatha relatively well if you know what you're doing in your deck. So conceivably, you could put in a Quicksilver to go on 1, Domino to go on 2, hopefully have Wave on 3 to reduce Agatha to play on 4, or have Sif on 3 to kill Agatha, and then have Ghost Rider pull her back on 4. So this one right here, this Crossbones, you could probably take out and do a Quicksilver if you absolutely wanted something in turn 1. Most times this deck not getting off the ground on until turn 2 is absolutely fine. The big key is you want to keep any 6-drops away from Agatha, which is why the only 6-drop here, aside from Agatha, is America Chavez, who should hopefully not be coming into your hand while Agatha still needs to be resolved. Other win conditions are dropping a Red Skull and having Taskmaster clone Red Skull, potentially cloning Spider-Woman for a solid 8, Arrow for a solid 8, Devil Dinosaur, who could hopefully get around 8 to 10 to 12 right there, have Taskmaster, clone that. Although I'm not actually too sure if Taskmaster clones the base value or the calculated value. But yeah, the deck is mostly designed to autopilot itself so that Agatha kind of doesn't get in the way of herself. It's interesting how Brody does not make mention of that. So before we get into Nebula, I'm going to just walk down how my animal season wrapped up over here. So I got up to level 62 in the season pass. Here's me opening the caches at the time, 20 hit monkeys, some gold, got the cyborg hit monkey, and a Alan Davis variant for Sentinel. So that makes 1 original Sentinel and 2 variants for me. Finished up my daily, finished up the entire Animals Assemble chapter, which I was really happy about, and finished off at 35. Now, you may be thinking, geez, Napalm 35 is not really that good. That's because my goal isn't necessarily the PvP side of it. It's to play for fun and challenge myself to come up with working decks and counter metas and be inventive. So I'm not really concerned about that. There was the Cats Rule and the Dogs Rule teams. My Stegron and Jeff are in the shop. Jeff is pinned. Stegron is unpinnable. I would not be spending 5,000 tokens on Ghost Rider. Stegron is moving enemy from here to another location. My fast upgrades were Silver Surfer, Infinite, and Morph at that time. I decided to pull the trigger to Silver just to get a little bit more, a reasonable amount more collection level. Even though I'm not really actively using Silver Surfer much right now. Pulled collector tokens, which is great, as it gets me closer to Jeff. And nothing crazy there. So these are all the cards I need to upgrade. Mostly it's me holding on to the boosters to save them for upgrading the ones that I want to do rather than the ones that are upgradable. I do switch over to Luke Cage Sports over here instead of the default Luke Cage look. If I have a variant, I prefer to use it over the standard, unless the only variant I have is a Pixel or potentially the Dan Hips. I'm not always that crazy about the Dan Hip ones. That Psylocke looks like Aeon Flux from MTV. As you can see, man, there is a lot of upgrading I can do. Quake doesn't have a variant, so I decided to upgrade her. And near my Quake, you can see the Sentinels that I have, the original and 2 variants. I like both of the variants. I don't know which one I would use. Several Patriots, several Rogues. Debris. I want to see if I can get over to that chibi Debris. Hysterically funny baby Thor. Maximus, no variant, so I'm going to upgrade that one. Maximus, I think, could work well with Ronin and Darkhawk. Here is, I call this one the Ichigo Kurosaki, this Mr. Negative. It just reminds me a lot of Bleach. There's my Shuri and Super Skrull, which are relatively new. Dazzler, which is new. A variant for Enchantress. There's my Ronin. MODOK, who I do kind of want to get switched over to the variant, but I think I like the original more. Gardening Hela. There's Helicarrier, which I picked up recently. Kind of happy for that one. Here is my... You can see how much I've been splitting my Agatha, because she gets all the boosters when you run her. If you're not running Agatha, I'm not too sure if you know that, but when you win with Agatha in your deck, she will go ahead and be the one that scarfs up all the boosters at the end of the match. So she's very interesting in that way. And here is going to be my first black crackle after the infinity split here. Squirrel Girl boosters, more credits, and there it is. There's my black crackle Agatha Harkness. She's definitely the only card in my entire library that is so advanced, and that is because it is guaranteed that the boosters will go to her. It would be fun to switch over to the OG old lady Agatha at some point, but since primary Agatha is now so far advanced with the black crackle and everything, I may stick with her just a little bit longer. Because she's the only one that I have that does that. I was trying to see if it would give me a description up there. But yeah, there's my Agathas. That's the card that I have split the most. Professor variant or OG Agatha would be nice to get into at some point. This was all along was a really fun deck. I liked playing it, even having the AI. I mean, having the AI kind of make the decisions for me was lazy, but it also fun because you never really knew how bad they were going to be. I ditched my Cerebro 2 and started this up for Cerebro 3, which is Wasp, Bast. People have Adam Warlock here for Scarlet Witch, but I don't have Adam Warlock. So Scarlet Witch is in there, Sentinel, Cerebro, Mystique, Cosmo, Killmonger, Rhino, Shang-Chi, Iron Man, and Valkyrie. So now what we want to go ahead and do is talk about Nebula and the kind of impact she is going to make. So Nebula is a new card that says each turn your opponent doesn't play a card here, plus 2 power, except for the turn you play this. So if you drop her on 1, and the enemy doesn't drop a card in that lane on 1, nothing happens. She doesn't get boosted. But she will then get boosted in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, potentially 7, if you're running magic. I think that is, now that I say that out loud, I think that is a potentially fine idea for Nebula, is to try to run her in a magic deck, get her out in 1, and see if you can boost her for 7 rounds instead of 6. That could be really interesting. A lot of people have been focusing on Nebula plus Guardians, and let's talk about that now before we go into my idea. So Nebula says, if the opponent doesn't play a card here, plus 2 power. You have cards like Mantis and Rocket that if your opponent played a card here this turn, Rocket goes up 2 power, so he becomes a 1/4, and Mantis gives you a card from their deck. Personally, I think Mantis is the weakest option to pair with Nebula. So the Guardian style for running Nebula is if you drop Nebula in a lane early and the enemy is like, okay, I don't want to power up that Nebula, let me try to play cards in the lane that Nebula's in. So when Nebula drops, she is immune to any negative effects about ongoing or on reveal. She has a passive power. So people like Cosmo and Enchantress can't shut her down. So she goes good anywhere where she might not actually get destroyed or bounce back, like Luke's bar or something like that. So Yondu doesn't count. Mantis is, I think, a little weak. Rocket is the first one who has synergy with her, because if the opponent's like, oh, I'm going to shut down that Nebula, let me throw a card over there, Rocket can then become a 1/4 instead of a 1/2. Then from there, the next one that you have is Star-Lord. Star-Lord can turn into a 2/5 if placed with Nebula and somebody goes to shut down Nebula. So right now we're looking at 3 potential cards in the lane. Nebula, Rocket, and Star-Lord, which only leaves room for one more. Drax comes in at the 5 energy mark, and he can become a 4/8 if somebody plays a card there. So now, essentially, with those 3 extra Guardian cards, you can fill up a Nebula lane to all the way to turn 4 and say, okay, if you're going to play a card here, you're going to suffer by boosting my Guardians. Once we get beyond Drax, we have Gamora at the 6 drop. Should be seeing Gamora. Hold on one second. Is she not on reveal? Let me take. Wait a minute. Gamora is 5. 1 second. There she is. Yeah, on reveal, if your opponent played a card here this turn, +5 power. So you can cover Nebula pretty much all the way up from 1 to 5 and say, okay, if you want to try to shut my Nebula down, you are going to suffer some consequences by beefing up my Guardians. So that's one style of play. I think absolutely, if you're going to run Nebula, you're going to need an armor. You got to protect her. Otherwise, Killmonger is going to be like, that's a nice new card you got there. It would be a shame if I happened. So I personally think no matter what you do with the Guardians, you should run an armor. So if you want to follow a linear progression, you can drop out the Star-Lord and just run like Nebula, Rocket, armor, or honestly, Nebula, armor, Drax, and Gamora could be a really, really good lane. I just think it's very, very risky to run Nebula without some way of protecting her. This deck over here that I designed does not go through with the Guardians of the Galaxy method. And honestly, the Guardians of the Galaxy method is kind of a win-win for you no matter what happens. And Nebula sets this up in a lot of her decks. It is essentially the Iocane powder sequence from Princess Bride. With Nebula on the field and you drop her in a lane, once she's seen more, enemies might go, wait a minute, or your opponents might go, wait a minute. There's a Nebula there. I bet what the person's going to do is put a Guardian of the Galaxy there. I don't want to put a card there. I'll let Nebula take the +2 power because I don't want a big Drax. I don't want a big Gamora. I don't want a big Star-Lord. I'm going to place this card here in this not Nebula lane. And then you could say, hey, I bet this opponent's going to be intelligent and they're not going to fall for it. Let me go ahead and put a Guardian of the Galaxy over here instead. So you wind up in these nearly completely winnable situations because you're going to keep the enemy off their toes. And if you think about it, it really is the Iocane powder sequence. Hey, wait a minute. You know that I'm smart, so clearly I can't place my card on the Nebula lane because I'm expecting a Guardians of the Galaxy. But you know that I'm really, really smart, and I'm not going to fall for that. So I'm going to put the card over here and not the Nebula lane. But you're probably smart too. So you're going to put a Guardian of the Galaxy here. It's very, very interesting. Nebula is going to create a tremendous amount of mental mind games between you and live opponents. The way that I did in this Nebubast deck is I didn't go the Guardians of the Galaxy route. I did it with Bast and trying to really choke out the enemy lane that Nebula is in. So ideal turn 1 is Bast to maybe hopefully boost Nebula before she gets out of the gate, which could negate the fact that she's not dropping in round 1, and also maybe boost Hood so that Hood drops as a 1/1 instead of a 1-2. And then, of course, you have the good demon coming through. Forge, if Forge goes earlier than Nebula, Forge can assist Nebula missing a turn or two by boosting her. So if you didn't play her in round 1, and then you did eventually, say, turn 3, Forge into Nebula, Forge on 2, Nebula on 3, she kind of makes up for some of her lost time. There's Star-Lord in there just to kind of go with Nebula. If Nebula gets out on 1, you could Star-Lord on 2 or Armor on 2. This way Killmonger does not drop on 3 and get rid of your Nebula before she even really gets any power. Green Goblin in the Nebula lane, Hobgoblin in the Nebula lane, all to try and clog up the other side so the person can't play a card to turn off Nebula, even if they want to. Cosmo in the Nebula lane to maybe keep people out. They're like, oh crap, there's a Cosmo there. I can't play a card in the Nebula lane and shut her down because it's a non-reveal card. You could also use Enchantress and say ongoing cards aren't going to work in the Nebula lane. Instead of Enchantress, I went with Spider-Man. Kazar is here to boost Nebula and a few others. And Blue Marvel is there to boost Nebula too. So it's, if she gets powered up, it kind of works. If she dropped really, really late, then this deck has got some issues with a win condition. The Guardians of the Galaxy style would have an issue with the win conditions too if Nebula winds up going late, because then you're not, like, what are you baiting people into? So ideally, you pull Nebula, for my style, ideally Bast on 1, Nebula on 2, hopefully protect her on 3, and there you go. I had a really, really funny match yesterday, and I think it is, was it this one with Liam? No, not the Bifrost one. Maybe it was this final one over here. No? Okay. That's interesting. I was using my Cerebro 3. I guess it didn't upload for a particular reason. I was using my Cerebro 3, and I had that moment where the rightmost lane was fill this lane with the copies of the card that you played here. So you drop the one card, and the whole lane gets filled up with copies of that card. And I was like, oh, that's great. I'm going to go ahead and play my Cerebro there. And I'm going to have a lane of 4 Cerebros. That'd be great. What the enemy did was he played a Hobgoblin, and the Hobgoblin came over. So I had a Cerebro, 3 Hobgoblins, and then he had 2 of the Hobgoblins on his side. So, yeah, I had 3 times -8. He had 2 times -8. So he was definitely winning that lane, and that lane was choked out for me. However, I did pull out the victory by winning the other lanes, which was really, really funny. But I was like, damn, this is a big brain play. I'm going to get a whole bunch of Cerebros over there. And he was thinking, yep, or she was thinking, yep, I'm going to have a big brain play over here. I'm going to send over a whole bunch of Hobgoblins and really screw this lane over. So, what do you guys think about Nebula? Where do you, how meta do you think she will be? I think she fits in a bunch of different style decks, and that's one of the best things I think they can do with this card. When a card comes out, there's really only one hard line way of playing the card. I don't think it's that great. I think it's too narrow, it's too linear. When a card comes out that you can play several different ways, like Nebula can go a boosted route, drop a little later in the match, but get boosted along the way and make up for the missing rounds, and then still escalate later on. You can play her what I think is the most obvious way and the least amount of thought is play her the Guardian way, pair her off with Star-Lord, Rocket, Drax, Gamora, maybe Drax, Gamora, Odin, for 4, 5, and 6 over there. That kind of a way. She does not have any synergy, obviously, with Mr. Negative. She's got synergy with Bast. Not real synergy with Valkyrie. Valkyrie drops too late to really do anything for her. I think she's got synergy with Magic to give her another turn to increase. I think, depending on your deck, maybe even her and Sunspot could work out particularly well. Both of them sitting there escalating. I think one of the key things is you're going to have to protect her from being destroyed by Killmonger. You could go a completely brand new route with Nebula and do a giant swerve and put her in a lane, let her build up, and then Venom her later on. Destroy her and eat her up and bring the power over. Maybe even a Hulkbuster. Let her power up a bunch and then Hulkbuster drop, Venom drop. Could be really, really interesting. I think it opens up a lot of play styles, and if a lot of people start running Guardian Nebula, I think that will create fun scenarios where people are doing, like what I said, doing like a Bast Nebula and letting her build up that way instead of the damned if you do, damned if you don't Guardian way. So what do you guys think? How did you finish up last season? And what are you going to be running this season? I think I'd stick with the Agatha All Along deck for a while, unless I'm doing specific dailies on things. So let me know what you guys think. Have a good one.